So we're going to talk a little bit further about graphing secant and cosecant function. You just got done watching a great YouTube video on, there's a guy talking about secant and cosecant. And one thing remember he said is that the secant is the same as 1 over cosine. Or if you have the cosine function, you know that the reciprocal of the cosine function is the secant function. And the reciprocal of the sine function is the cosecant. And so he did a nice job of graphing those out. And I just want to show you just a couple tricks of the trade in graphing secant and cosecant. It makes it pretty easy to graph. Okay, so four steps. Step 1, if you're given the secant or the cosecant function, you already very familiar graphing cosine and sine. So I want you to first graph the sine function if it's a cosecant, or graph the cosine function if it's a secant graph. So if I say graph y equals 2 cosecant of theta, well then really what I want you to do first is graph y equals 2 times the sine of theta. Oh, oops, I'm sorry. Or if you're asked to graph y equals 1/2 of the secant of 4 theta, what I really want you to graph first is the cosine function of y equals 1/2 the cosine of 4 theta, because it's just the reciprocal function, and if we know how to graph that quickly, then I know right where my asymptotes are and I can make my U-shape curves. So step 1 when graphing secant and cosecant is to graph the sine and the cosine graph first. Step 2 is just find or draw in your asymptotes. Okay? Remember, your asymptotes is a line that a curve approaches but it never touches. So when you looked at those graphs and say you had your, oops, let me dot that, your asymptotes, the curve is approaching it but it never touches it. Approaches but never touches it. So again, an asymptote is a line that the curve approaches but never touches. So if you're graphing secant and cosecant, the first thing you do is you're going to graph your sine graph, your cosine graph. The second thing is you're going to draw in your asymptotes. Remember, those are always where the sine or cosine is equal to 0. And the third thing you're going to do is then just draw in your U-shapes. Pretty easy. And step 4, name your period. And your period is going to be the same as whatever the sine or cosine period was. And just remember, there is no amplitude. Okay? So let's take a look at how easy this might really be. Okay? So he graphed he graphed cosecant and he graphed secant already for you. So we're going to take a look at a couple other ones. Let's take a look at, let's do y equals 2 times the secant of theta. So right away I know that this is the reciprocal function of cosine. So step 1, graph 2 cosine of theta. Well, that means I have an amplitude of 2. And my period is going to be 2 pi over b, but the b is 1, so it'll just be 2 pi. So then I'll be looking at pi over 2. I'll also be at pi, 3 pi over 2, and back at 2 pi. And we'll go negative pi over 2, negative pi. So, and what I recommend is when you do graph your cosine function first, you graph it with a pencil really lightly.